Hello and welcome back to another tutorial. Okay, so this one we're going to be looking at GitHub Actions. Well, in fact, I'm going to take you through a whole process here of setting up GitHub. So this is phase 1, 2, and 3. We're going to set up GitHub with Django, do a little bit of testing, cover coverage again and what it does, and have a little look at styling conventions, PEP8, for example, and have a look at the Flake package. So we're going to go through those steps, and then we're going to then move on to GitHub Actions in step 4. Now, by all means, if you don't want to go through setting up GitHub and Django testing, etc., and you want to go straight to the GitHub Actions, then just have a look in the timeline and start on section 4. So just to kind of illustrate what it is we're trying to achieve in this tutorial. So we're going to be utilizing Visual Studio Code to develop an application. Eventually, we're going to want to push that application over to GitHub. And now we're going to then configure or create some actions based upon an event that's happened. In this case, we've pushed a repository over to GitHub, or we push some code over to GitHub. So GitHub Actions are essentially ways to kind of automate tasks in our kind of software development lifecycle here. So for example, we're going to create a workflow, an automated kind of task, which is going to automatically check the quality of our code, for example, that we've uploaded. And also it's going to then run some tests and also run, for example, other applications like coverage, which is going to give us some detailed information about the tests. So we could go on, in actual fact, we're not going to do this in this tutorial, but we could also write the action to then deploy the code. So this is what we end up with in GitHub after the action's taken place and completed that we've performed. We'll see a nice little overview of all the steps that we've taken, or all the steps the action has taken. And then we can also then drill down and find some specific information. Okay, so like I said, you can skip ahead to different sections of this tutorial. I'm just going to now take you first through creating a new GitHub repository, initializing the Django directory and project, and then configuring it and then pushing it over to GitHub. Just go through that process using the command line. I'll then go to part 2, where we create some simple models, introduce coverage to, and then we'll introduce Django unit testing, just really kind of small introduction so that we can build a simple test so that we can then run it in GitHub. And then we're going to move to part 3 and have a look at Python code quality. Now, I'll explain this when we get to this part here, but we're going to have a look at PEP8 and Flake. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, head over to part 3. And then, like I've already said, part 4, we're then going to move on to GitHub Actions. I'll give you a brief introduction of the structure of actions that we build, and then we're going to build a set of actions so that we can test our application. Okay, so let's get coding. First of all, let's go to phase went. There we go. So that will allow us to actually do something. So just to remind you again, you can use the timeline if you want to skip sections. I'll try and break the sections down enough so that you can just move to the next section. By all means, also use the code repository that's connected to this tutorial so you can easily kind of skip past different sections. Because I'm going to start from complete basics here for those who would or need this. And obviously, I don't want to bore other people who know how to do this already. So we're going to make a new Django project. So let's go and create open a new folder here. I'm just going to go to a desktop. And I'm just going to type in a new project name. So this is going to be called Django Testing. This is a new folder. I actually need to make the folder, I guess, first. That makes sense. Django Testing. There we go. So I'm going to create a new project folder. Okay, so now what I need to do is create my virtual machine. So I'm assuming you've got Python installed on your machine. Let's see if I can drag this up. There we go. So this is a Windows machine. So I'm going to, first of all, we're going to just create our virtual environment. So the virtual environment is VMV, virtual environment. I'm going to make a new folder called venv. So we'll go ahead and do that. So that's just going to take a couple of seconds on yours potentially. So now I can actually activate this virtual environment. Just need to navigate to this. I'm using tab here instead of typing in all the commands. So now I've activated, I can see that it's activated here because it says the name of the folder, venv. And of course, now I can go ahead and pip install. So use the package manager, pip install Django. That'll take a couple of seconds. And then once that's done, we need to make a new Django project. So now we've got access to the Django admin. That's through the package that we've just installed. So let's start project. And we're going to call this core. And I'm going to put a space and then a dot at the end. That's important so that the core folder is provided here instead of me making a new folder called core and then the project inside of that. So it's core space dot. Obviously it's wrapped over to the next line. There we go. So now I've got this folder here and I've got my settings, etc. inside of that. And I've got the manage py file now, which I can use to create a new application. So now I can just type in manage.py and then start app. And then I'm going to create an app here. I'm just going to call this, I'm going to call this blog for now. Okay, so now we've got a new project folder. I just need to register that because we're going to be setting up some models. So let's go ahead in the core settings and just add that to the installed apps. There we go. Okay. So now we're going to connect up our GitHub account to our package so we can start to push some data, some files over to our repository that's stored on GitHub. So let's first of all start by logging in if you haven't already done so, or signing up, and then creating a new repository. I'm going to call this Django or testing with Django. And then this is going to be a public repository. I'm not going to add anything else here. So just testing with Django, create a repository. And that's pretty much all we need to do here. So now what we need to do is just connect our project to GitHub so that we can start uploading some files. So back in our project now, let's go ahead and initialize this project so that we can use it and upload to GitHub, for example. So we do that by typing in git init initialize. So what's happened now behind the scenes, I've just closed that, is a new folder has been created in our project. Now you won't see that folder here, it's a .git folder. That's just going to store information about any changes that we made and track some of these files, etc. You can see that we've got these green dots now representing something to do with source control, etc. So first thing we want to do is we don't want to upload certain files to GitHub, for example. We don't want to track certain files. So for example, the event folder here, the virtual environment, is a folder that we don't want to include and upload to GitHub, for example. So what we can do is we can create a new file here called gitignore. So this file here is going to tell Git basically not to track or upload certain files and folders. So what we can do is if we just head over to, if you're not familiar with this, you can go over to Google. Well, actually, it's just right here. Head over to Google, type in Django gitignore, and then go over to the total.com page here. And someone's created a kind of a template which you can use for your gitignore page. So let's have a look at this. And what this is a kind of all the common files and folders that you wouldn't want to track with Git. So for example, here we don't want to track the event folder. You can see now that automatically with Visual Studio Code in place, it's detected which files or folders won't be tracked. And you can now see it's turned to gray. So the gray represents files and folders that won't be tracked that are actually inserted or defined here in this gitignore file. So here, for example, if we just move down, I think we've kind of moved past it, but there's a folder here, the VM folder, here it is. So that's an indication and indicator to not to track that folder, for example. So have a look at that. Right, so now we've got that in place, we can now go ahead and add our file so that we can then create our first commit. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's do a git commit and then we're going to just basically do our first commit. So I'm going to call this FC for first commit. So that's basically going to try to record the current state of our application. You notice that there's a problem because what we haven't done is git add. So do that first and then run the commit, and you can see that it's found all the files and is kind of committed that to our, I guess, our first kind of package or the base or the entry point so that we can start tracking these files. So now that's all in place. What we can now do is we can define the branch. So what branch we want to use, this is just going to be our kind of our main branch, our core or primary branch. It might be that eventually we're working with different branches, so we might want to kind of move data to different branches, but this is going to be the main branch. So we set that up. So now we need to add the remote repository where we want to kind of send all these files. So let's go ahead and just copy this. This is a repository we built earlier. So we'll just copy this link here and we'll go back and we'll just paste that in. So that's adding the kind of the origin where we want to send and maybe push or pull our data from. And now we've got that in place, we can now go and actually try this out. So let's go ahead now and push this across. So git push, then we just need the origin where we want to push it. And then we can also define, then define what branch. In this case, ours was called main. So let's try that out. Now, I'm already logged into GitHub. It might be that a new window appears and you'll be asked to log in. And then once that's done, this will take place. But you can see here that that seemed to have happened okay. So now we can go ahead and check the repository online. So if we go back in and refresh, you can now see that our project has been uploaded successfully. So to quickly run you through that process again, if you're not familiar, so just make a change to one of your files, for example. And once you've made a change, you'll then just need to run, in this case, GitHub add, and that just adds any files that you've made changes to. For example, you can specify what changes you want to add to the next commit. So I select dot, referring to everything. And then what you need to do is you need to run a commit again. So we've made changes. So we will make a new commit now. So this basically means that whatever we previously saved the state as, we're now going to update it and track those new changes. So we're going to call this new commit, so NC, and there we go. So we've made a new commit with those new changes. So now what we can do is we can then go ahead and git, and then we want to push this over to the origin and then define the repository. Okay, sorry, the branch. So now we've done that. If we move back into GitHub here and go into, for example, the blog and then models, you can see that those are the changes that we made, the comment there. Okay, so that was a brief overview of getting the new project started, initializing the Git repository in your Django project directory, and then just configuring and pushing your project over to GitHub. So now we've done that. Now let's move ahead. We're just going to create a simple model for our application. And then I'll take you through just an introduction to coverage. So you've got a general idea of what it is, and then you can go off and explore some of the other features that it provides. And then I'll give you a quick introduction to Django unit testing. So we're going to build just a single test here so that we can then fire it off and start it using GitHub Actions. So check out the other guides in this channel for a little bit more in-depth about models, etc. So we are going to just build a very simple model here. I'm not going to type this out. So we're going to create a new model here in the blog models. I'm going to call this post. So we're making a blog here. So we're going to create this new table essentially, or this new model called post, extending from models. And then I'm just going to add some attributes here. So title, which is going to be a character field with a max length of 255, an author, for example. And there may be just a slug here so that we can save the kind of the URL directory for specific posts. And then we're going to create this dunder method here, the string dunder method. So this is a default output for a post item that would, for example, appear on the admin page. And then we're just going to return self.title, and that's going to be the default output. Okay, so that's a simple model. So let's go ahead and now clear that. Oh, wrong page. We'll go ahead and clear that. And then we'll just run, for example, make migrations. So we're just going to set up our table now. Oh, I spelled that wrong. Make migrations. I've done it wrong again. I've got two M's this time. Okay, third time lucky. There we go. So we make migrations, and then we're going to go ahead and migrate. So that's going to apply our new migration that we've set up to the database. So that's just basically going to set up the original initial Django models and also this new model here that we've just created. So now we've got this in place, we have our model, so now we can potentially do or perform some testing. So now head over to the test file in the blog application. This would have been automatically created for you when you created the blog application. So inside of here, you can see that it automatically adds a new line here, django.test import test case. And that's essentially a wrapper around the built-in Python test suite. So now we have kind of access to this. We can now go ahead and think about writing a test. Of course, if you're new to testing, new to writing tests here in Python and Django, the first question you might ask yourself is, what do I need to test? So if you're not used to or you're not familiar with testing or not too sure what you actually need to test, for example, a test coverage reporting tool like the one we're going to install basically shows you how much of your code is tested and then potentially offers suggestions on what other tests need to be created. So this can be a good way of starting testing to identify what tests might be needed in your application. So go ahead and install coverage. So pip install coverage. And then we can run coverage to make sure it's kind of installed properly. We can just run the coverage command. So pretty much every command is going to start with coverage when we're using coverage. And then we can run, for example, version. That would tell us what version we got. There we go. And then we can move on and then run some tests. So we don't actually have any tests at the moment, but let's just run this. So coverage and then run. And then we're going to need our manage py and then test. So the keyword here is test. So you can see that it's ran no tests at all. And it's done that in 0.00 seconds. Okay, so now we've done that, what we can now do is potentially run a report. So this is all the power of coverage. So let's just run the report. This is going to give us a report here in the terminal. So what you're looking at here is an overview of all the things that it's found within my application and then potentially where tests might need to occur or where they might be needed. So for new developers, maybe this isn't the most intuitive here. So what we also have is this ability to get a kind of GUI interface. So we can go ahead and type in coverage and HTML. So that's going to create a new folder inside of your project. Give it a couple of seconds. And there it is. So it's called HTML cov. Notice it goes gray straight away because in the git ignore file, it's already been set up to ignore this folder. So if you open up the repository for this, you can see that we've got a new folder here called HTML cov. Inside of here, we've got an index file. So we can just open that up. There we go. And you can now see in here is a little bit of a more intuitive report. And you can see we've got the blog admin, for example, what we've got here, we've got this new app here called blog. We've got models here. And notice that we're missing one test. So it suggests that we're missing one test. And I can click on this link And that drills down then into that page and identifies where potentially a test is required. Now notice that, for example, here it's gone into the event folder and it's provided me loads of information about the packages inside of the virtual environment folder. So there's always going to be a case where you want to kind of exclude folders and files. So we can also do that with coverage. So what we need to do is just type in coverage run and then the double dash omit equals, and then the folder name, in this case, venv. So we're going to run our tests utilizing this. So after this, obviously, we're going to need manage py and then test. So that's going to run the tests. And so this time, when we kind of run our coverage again, HTML, that's going to regenerate the reports. And then we can go back into our index again. And this time you can see that it's excluded all the virtual environment folders. Okay, so now we've got that in place. Let's go ahead and just build a simple test. So back into our, let's just remove all this for now. So let's go back into our blog and we're going to go into our tests. So we've imported the test case. That's going to provide us access to the Python test framework so that we can run some tests. So what we need to do here is to build some tests. So we start off with a class and we're going to call this model testing, for example. So I need to bring in test case. So I have access to all the tools that I'm going to need to test. And now what I can now do is set up some functions. So the first function that you might want to set up would be called setup. Okay, so we're going to take in self. So if you're not familiar with self, so the self parameter is basically a reference to the current instance, this current instance of the class. And it's basically used to access variables that belong to the class. So it allows us to kind of access other variables or allow us to have access to other variables in this class. So here's self. Okay, so now we're going to set up an instance of our database. So what's happening here in our tests is that we want to test the database. Now we've obviously got the production database or the main database of our application. When we run some tests, we don't want to, or we're not going to initially utilize that database. We're going to set up a separate testing database so that we can then run some tests. So what we need to do is actually we need to build that database. So we're going to need to bring that database in. So from .models, we're going to import that. So it was called post. So we're bringing that model so that we can replicate it in a new database. Now we want to set up. So what we're going to do here is just create some new data for our database. So we're going to say self dot and then blog. And that's a variable that we can then utilize to access that data in another function. And now we're going to take the post table. Now we need to use the default manager, so which is objects. So that's the default model manager objects. And then we're going to use the keyword create. And that's going to allow us to create some new data in our database. So what we're going to need here is we're going to need a name, because that's the first attribute or field in our model, if I remember. So we're going to need a title, author, and slug. And these are all character fields and a slug. So let's just go back to our tests. So name, and that's going to equal just, let's just call this Django. And then we also had author. Give it a space. Author equals, and that's just going to be Django again. And we're not going to put anything inside of the slug. Or no, let's do it. Slug equals, and then we're just going to say again Django. Okay, right. So we've got a name, an author, and a slug. So that's what's going to be created. We're going to create a new instance within our database, and then we're going to make that available through this variable here. So now we've got this set up, this data set up. So what's going to happen here is that when the tests are run, this is going to automatically run first, and it's going to basically prepare this inside of this variable here, blog. So what we now need to do, so let's go ahead and now build a test or something to test against. So let's go self, and then we're going to use assert true. So you can see there's a number of different asserts here, and essentially what we're building here is the logic almost. I like to think of these, at least begin with, or describe them as kind of functions that perform an action. So if you think about here, what we're doing is we're running a kind of a simple if statement, say. That's one way to think of it. So we're saying here, in this case, if our data does go into the database, then what is returned is true. So therefore, we're going to run an assert true to check to see if we return true based upon that function. And if it is true, it means that our test is successful and our data meets the requirements or matches the data type, in this case, for our table. So we're expecting character fields and the slug field. So here we're essentially just checking to make sure that our data is modeled correctly to our model. Okay, so assert true. So now what we need to do is actually set up the test. So for example, is instance. So we're running an instance here. So we're going to put an instance inside of our database. So the data is D, and then the database is going to be post. So we're going to take this instance here, and we're going to try and put it into our post table. Right, and if it is true, if it does work, it's going to return true. Therefore, the test will pass. So let's just give this a go to see if this works. So we're just going to run in the terminal, of course, py manage py, and then just the word test. So we return OK, and there we go. We ran one test. So how it's running one test is because if we go back here, Django is going to pick up any files that begin with the word test or name test. So tests. So you can see that Django automatically finds this file and then runs those tests. So back to our coverage report. Previously, we looked at the, the models, and there was one test that needed to be completed. And that was to test to make sure that a post returns by default the title. So that's kind of a string return. If we were to collect one of these items in this table, what will get returned is a reference, and that would be the title of that instance that is returned from the database. So let's go ahead now and see if we can build a test around ensuring that that is complete. So we'll do it just below here. So let's go ahead and do self. Now we're going to use one of these other tools. So this time we're going to use assert equal. So we're going to check to see if something's equal. So whereas before we checked to see if an outcome was true, now we can do assert false as well, for example. So here we've got assert equal. So we're going to check to see if two things are equal. So if 1 equals 1, then assert true is going to be true. So assert equal is going to be true. Therefore, the test will pass. So this time we just need to define the two things we want to compare in this case. So the string from the instance. So that's the string return from the instance. So remember, what gets returned by default is the word Django from the instance. So D, and then what we need to do is define the actual thing to compare it against. So what should get returned from this instance is the title. That's the string return here, self title. So we know the title is called Django. So we can then compare it against the word Django. And then we're just going to run that off. So let's just do another test. And now you can see we're just running one test again. So this is one suite of tests here. Of course, we could break this up into two tests if you wanted to, but this is just one suite of tests. That's why it says run one test. Right, so what we can do now is just mix this up a little bit. So let's just make it fail, for example. There we go. So now it's failed, and we get this failed message here. And it gives us a general idea of what potentially is the problem. So not there, just here. So here, for example, it says it's not equal. So it's returned Django, but it's not equal to what we're expecting or what we've written Django with an S. So therefore, should we make some changes? So it's kind of clear what it is that needs to be changed. So now we've run this test, or we built this test. Let's go ahead now and just update and see if we can now change what has been returned here in coverage to see if we can get this to go to 100%. So let's go ahead and go back into let's go back into the command prompt. Now, just to save a little bit of time, I'm just going to type that in. So we're just going to use coverage now, admit the event folder. So we just run that again, and then we can then run the coverage HTML again. So that's just going to recreate the page here. So we can just refresh. Well, let's just go back here. So refresh, and you can now see the models are 100% completed, and there isn't any missing because we've just built this test here for that. Okay, so that was some really simple unit testing there with Django, introducing this idea of coverage. Again, there'll be some other tutorials on this channel which you can then follow and go in a little bit more detail. I just wanted to get that up and running for those who haven't used testing before. So now I want to introduce something I've not done before on this channel, talking a little bit about code quality. I want to introduce you to PEP 8 and also installing Flake and having a look at how Flake can create better code or improve the quality of our code. So code quality generally refers to a number of different things, but generally good code quality is considered to be well tested. It follows maybe consistent styling. So this is why I'm introducing, for example, PEP 8 in this case. It needs to be understandable. You know, we need to make sure that it's well documented in certain places potentially. It's easy to maintain by following essential kind of coding guidance and methodologies, for example. And of course, we want to avoid any security vulnerabilities. So when we think of code quality, we can compare our code to those type of qualities. So without going into some major detail here, basically PEP 8, if you just type it into Google, it's easily readable here. Basically, this is some guidelines, some official guidelines that provide us some best practices on how to write Python code. You can see here from reading this that PEP 8 is suggested to improve or focus on improving the readability and consistency of the Python code. So there's quite a lot to this in actual fact. If you go over to the python.org and have a look at the PEP 8 there, the style guide, you can see that the content is quite long. So it would take a fairly long time to cover all these aspects here. But let's just go through some of the basic things here, or indeed, we might not need to read this at all because this is why we're going to install a program called Flake. So let's just follow the path here. So I mentioned PEP 8. It's a style guide for Python code. So have a look through that. Then what we're going to do here to kind of enforce that styling guide is we're going to install Flake 8. Now Flake 8, this project here, basically, like it says, is a wrapper around these tools. So when we install Flake 8, it's also going to install this PyFlakes and the PyCode style, and also the Ned McCabe script. So these things are going to be installed. So PyFlakes, essentially, this is a project, a simple program, basically, which will check Python source files for errors. So it's going to kind of analyze the program and detect various errors that might be in our program. So next up here, we've got the PyCode style. So this is going to perform similar actions again. It's going to have tools inside this package, which is going to check our code against kind of some of the conventions that have been described in the PEP 8. So let's just go ahead and get this installed. So I'm going to copy this across and I'm going to install. So pip install Flake 8. So now that's available. I can now run Flake 8. And then what's going to happen now is going to scan through all my Python files. And it's going to then produce a little report, potentially of some of the errors and changes that are going to need to be made in order to kind of meet some of these style conventions. So that's going to take an incredibly long time to probably work. And you can see that it's trying to access all the event folders. So clearly we don't want to check the styling of any of the code in the event folder. So we're going to need to find a way of kind of excluding files, similar to kind of like the git ignore here. We're going to need to find a way to kind of ignore some of these files and folders. So what we can do is we can create a new file here. This is going to be a setup.config. And then in here, we can define some parameters for flake 8. So in here, we can, for example, exclude. And then we just define what we want to exclude. So .git, for example, maybe any migrations, for example. And then, of course, we also want the event folder. Something like that. Okay, so another stylistic convention is that typically PEP8 is going to define a maximum line length, of 79 characters. Now, if we don't want to enforce that, we can head over to the Django admin, and then if we look down at the PEP8 styling convention and have a look at the style convention used for Django, it looks like they're using or allowing up to 119 characters. So what we can do is we can also change our parameters in the setup here, and we can, for example, set the max line length and that's going to equal 119. There we go. Okay, so that will then be some overrides or some additional configurations for flake 8. So let's go ahead now and just type in flake 8 again. Shouldn't take as long as last time because we're not going to scan the event folder, for example. And you can see here we've got some very clear instructions on what needs to be changed in order to meet some of these specifications. So what's also important here is that we can see that these flags have been created, or these error numbers have been designated to particular types of errors. And this can be really important once we start setting up our GitHub Actions, because we can perform certain actions if we do find certain errors. Now, it might be that we have certain specifications within our software development, which means that we want to actually overlook this, for example. Now, the problem is here, if we run this in GitHub Actions, it might cause an error. So we can kind of override based upon or dismiss certain errors. Or, for example, in GitHub Actions, we can set it up so, for example, we can capture certain errors that we want to capture. And if there is that particular error, it means that we don't want to then go ahead and deploy that piece of software. So it's an actual error that we can pick up, for example. So these error codes are really kind of useful for that as well. So you can see here we've got admin pi11 imported but unused. So in our admin file here, the fact is it's identified the fact that we've imported this in. This is obviously automatically created by Django, but we're not actually using it. So the code shouldn't be there necessarily. So that's kind of a good code in practice, right? So let's just do that one. And you can see that when I run it now, it's disappeared. So models again, 2 blank lines, found 1. So one of the stylistic conventions, if we go into the models here, is we must have 2 lines between our classes, for example, here. So if we move and make a new line there and go to flake 8, you can see that one has now disappeared. So there's a general stylistic convention that there should be a new line at the end of the file. So in our models, we just need to make sure that there is a new line. Get rid of the white space, and then we can run it again. And now we're going to run in the tests. So for 1, so tests on line 1. So we're just expecting a line break of 2 there. And then in the Django shortcuts, import unused. Okay, so Let's just do that one. And in the views, just get rid of that. That's just there by default because we created a new project, and there we go. So essentially what we've done now is that we can say that our code quality potentially has been enhanced through utilizing and following certain standards. So our code is now fully tested, and also we've implemented some code quality steps using PEP 8 type of parameters, and obviously the flake wrap around more other applications that perform code quality checks. So now we can move on to GitHub Actions. So warm welcome to GitHub Actions. So let's have a look at the GitHub Action tab. So you can see this is going to be in your repository by default. So GitHub Actions allows us to automate tasks. So this is a great part of our software development lifecycle. So when we start thinking about DevOps, CI/CD and so on, here we're going to perform some actions on our code. So what we can do essentially is what I've kind of spelled out before, is that we might want to push some code over to our repository and then an action takes place. So obviously what we're going to do is we're going to set up some testing actions on our Django code. But of course we might go ahead and also deploy once we've tested. That's something else that we could possibly do here. So what we can do to start off with, if you're new to this, if you look further down here, there's some kind of templates we can utilize or at least start off with. And what you'll find is if we select, for example, a basic Python package, set up this workflow, what happens is that in our repository, you can see that there's a .github folder, workflows, and inside of this is a YAML file here, which we're going to utilize to define our actions. Of course, you could build this manually in Visual Studio Code. So I'm just going to get rid of this. I'm just going to commit this page. I'm going to rename this testing, for example. And then I'm just going to commit this. So obviously now we're in a situation where if I go back to the repository, there's a new folder, and that's much more up to date than what is currently here in my terminal. So what I need to do is I just need to kind of pull that down and update my repository here. So let's go ahead and run the git pull. And then of course I want to pull the origin, and we can say the repository main. There we go. So you can now see that I pulled that down and we have a new folder here. That's what's just been created on GitHub. And you can see we've got the testing, and there was nothing inside of it. So now we're going to build up this action so that we can do some testing on our application automatically. So the anatomy of a GitHub action is fairly simple process. So the first thing that we can do is we can just define a name. I think this is an optional thing, but we can give this a name. So once we've decided on a name, the first section really is the event section. So this is basically defining a specific activity that's going to trigger the workflow that we're going to develop here in this activity. So kind of some basic triggers that we can think about initially is, for example, if we run a push to our repository, we might want to run this action. That's what we're going to do in this tutorial. But alternatively, we could also set it up to when someone pulls the repository, or potentially we could also set up a job, a cron job, which will run at a certain time. And these actions that we perform here or define here will run at that time. So let's go ahead and use the keyword on. And then we just basically need to define now. So in this case, it's going to be push. So we're going to define the fact that when this repository is pushed, when there's new files being pushed to this repository, something's going to happen. Now we can also drill down a little bit further into branches. So if you've got multiple branches in your repository, we can also have a look at those individually. And then we can define then what branch we want to run this on, one or multiple. Okay, so the syntax might, alternatively, you might see in the syntax using the brackets here. So we could also run it like this, for example. Okay, So now we've defined that. Alternatively, we could also run this on pull. So we could also just say pull request. So we can define it on this too. And then again, we can go ahead and just identify the branches we want to work on. And in this case, we've only got one branch called main. Space that. Okay. So just to give you a little brief overview, if you were going to set up a schedule. So here's our schedule. This has obviously been commented out. We can set up a cron here for the different times. So you've got minute, hour, day, month, and day of the week. So we can set up a cron activity here to run at a certain time. Okay, so now we've set out the event, defined when these actions are going to take place that we're going to, or steps that we're going to perform. Now we're going to build what is a job, or referred to a job. So a job is basically a set of steps that we're going to execute. And you'll probably hear this word runner, which I'll explain shortly. It's going to be executed on the same runner here. So let's go ahead and now set up our job. So we're going to define some parameters that defines how the job or the environment of the job, and then we're going to define the individual steps here. So let's go ahead, and what we're going to need to do is run a job, and then we're going to run a build. Okay, so what we're going to need to do here with this build, essentially what we're saying is that in order for us to actually run this code and run these tests that we want to run, well, we're going to need some sort of operating system to do that on. We're going to need some sort of environment. So in the back end, what's going to happen is we can define the working environment we want to run these tests on. So there's a few different options here, but we're just going to say runs on, and then Ubuntu, the latest version of Ubuntu. So this is obviously avoiding the many different options here. But basically what's going to happen here is that GitHub is going to spin up a virtual environment with Ubuntu, the latest version of Ubuntu. It's then going to run our commands that we set in our program inside of that environment. I guess that's how we can think of it at this point. Okay, so we've got runs on. So we've defined that. Have a look at the manual for all the other different steps if you want to then move a little bit further. But now we're going to define some steps. So what we're going to need to do is to actually get our code into that environment. So what we're going to need to do is to run these predefined kind of actions that have been created. So actions / and then we're going to need a checkout. We'll use version 2. So like I said, this is basically going to take our code, kind of connect everything up. So it puts our code into that virtual environment and sets things up. So that's a kind of a nutshell what's happening there. And now what we can do is set out a name. So what we can now do in each step of our process, we can define names. And that's basically defining different sections of our tests that we want to run. And that would then also then be depicted on the outcome of our action. So we have a nice little list. So for every name, there will be a list item within that list of events that have occurred in these actions here. So we'll match that up at the end. So let's just give that a name. So we're going to start off by, we're going to set up Python. And we're going to be running 3.7, I imagine at this point. So we're then going to define uses. So again, we're going to use some other actions. That's going to set up Python on this environment. So we're going to use the setup Python, and that's going to be version 2 as well. Okay, so that's essentially, I'm just generalizing here, but essentially what's happening now is we've got this operating system. We're now going to set up Python for this environment. And now we've done that, we can now kind of define what version, so with, and this is going to be Python version. So we can define what Python version we want. 3.7, there we go. And there we go. So now we've kind of set up our environment ready for us to now go further and start bringing in our code and running our code, etc. So let's first of all, we're going to create a new section. So we're going to have a name. And now what we want to do is we want to kind of install all the dependencies, right? So we're going to now install all the dependencies. So we're now going to run the new command run. So we can now actually run commands. So imagine now we spun up a new virtual machine. We've now set up Python automatically. Now we're in the console. So we're now running commands here as if we are in that console. So we're going to run some commands. So Python has been installed, etc., and it's available. So we're going to run Python -m. And then as we do to kind of start off with generally, we're just going to upgrade pip, for example. So get pip upgraded, that's the package manager. And then what we can then do is install all the dependencies for our project, which is normally in the requirements.txt file. We need to build that in a second. And there we go. So that's kind of the first step that's going to happen. So these two commands are going to be run on the terminal. And now we can then go on to the next stage. So everything is ready for us now to start doing our testing. So we have the name, and we're now going to kind of lint with flake 8. For those who are not familiar with that kind of coding terminology there, linting or lint, linting, like it says here, is an automated checking of the source code. So that includes stylistic errors. So notice and remember, we're going to set up PEP 8, and that essentially is part of this linting process. It's going to check the stylistic errors, for example. So this is why I've called it lint with flake 8. So let's just go back, lint with flake 8. Now we want to run some commands. So run. So observe all the tabbing and spaces. So run. And now we want to, first of all, pip install flake 8. Now we won't need to do this because it's probably already installed in the requirements text here, but I'm just showing you a general case. So let's first of all install it. And now, of course, we can just go ahead and run it. So just flake 8. So at this point, you can probably see where this is going. So we've installed and we've run that. So now we can then go ahead and go to name. And now we want to do the coverage report. So let's go ahead and do that. Lowercase. Now we need to, of course, run some commands again. So we're going to pip install coverage. And then obviously we can then run coverage. So it's going to be coverage and then run manage.py. And then we want the keyword test. Okay, so that's going to run the tests. And then next up, we want to then, of course, just run the report. So we can do a coverage and then the report. Remember, there was 2 reports that we can build. We can obviously build a HTML page, or we can just use the terminal. Of course, at this point, we don't want to start building a HTML page, etc. So let's just go with the terminal. So we're going to need coverage and then report. Okay, so that's coverage. So at this point, of course, you kind of start to see the style or the convention here. So let's just create a new name. Let's just call this Django testing. Of course, we don't need to do this. This is just to add something here and familiarize ourselves with this. So what we can do here is we can run a command. So let's just run, for example, Python 3 manage.py and then test. Obviously, that's just going to start the tests again, which is already done, we know. But there we go. So there we have our script now in place. I'm just going to save that. So let's go ahead now and git add. Let's just do everything again. And then we're going to git commit. It's going to be a new commit. And you can see there's going to be a few changes here. And then we just need to push it on. So let's push it over to the origin. And we're going to use main. So hopefully what will happen now is that if we go back into our repository here and go to actions, you can see here 15 seconds ago, it tried to actually run the workflow. So you can see that there's an error, which is good. So it says no steps defined in steps for the following jobs, build. So just looking back into the code, you can see that I've typed in step instead of steps. So while we're here, I might as well check the rest of the code. And so we've got user name, username. Okay, so it was just the S I think we had a problem with there. So let's just go through the same process again and just get that migrated. So hopefully you become a little bit more familiar with those commands. Of course, in practice, you wouldn't probably do that. You potentially use the extension here or GitHub desktop, at least to begin with. So let's go back into our repository and then go to actions again. So this time it looks like something's happening. It's gone yellow. So we can follow and track our build as it progresses through the stages. If I just click, you can see here we've successfully got through to the installing dependencies, and this is where it's going to fail, obviously, because we've forgotten to add our file here. So what we're going to need to do here is create a file called requirements.txt to pip freeze, which is going to define all the dependencies that are needed to run this application and testing. So we call that requirements.txt. That's what we've defined also in our setup. So we're going to install the requirements.txt. Okay, so inside of our requirements.txt then is all of our applications that we installed. So you can see it's got Flake, etc. here. Now, obviously, this is already going to also be installed again. Remember here, we're just asking it to be installed again here. Because potentially, if this was a production environment, you potentially wouldn't include that in your requirements. There'd be no need for you to include that as part of a deployment onto a server, for example, the coverage or the Flake, for example. So let's now go back and go through the laborious activity of committing and then pushing it back. So now we've updated this again. So let's go back into our actions. So we've run a new job again. So we can remove these. We can delete these workflows here if you want to. So we start again. Have a look at the build. So this time you can see it's actually installing all these dependencies. We've got to the installing dependencies. So you can actually see all the commands as they go along. So you can see that we've ran one test. Looks like it's okay. That was very quick. You can see that we've got the output here of coverage if we wanted to see that. And obviously we can use what I described earlier in the coverage section, the different commands to do different things here, output different things here. We've got the general Django testing we did, which is obviously similar to the coverage that we performed. That was just for the case of doing that. And there we go. So we have some kind of actions to do some post activities to tidy up some things, and then the job's complete. So we have a clear overview of exactly the workflow that we've just done. We've got the build. It looks like it's working okay. And there we go. So there we have a very simple workflow of creating a new Django project, setting up some tests, thinking about code quality, and then creating a GitHub Actions so that when we push to our GitHub repository, we can run some tests automatically. Now, obviously, in hindsight or in reality, you probably want to do those tests before you push your code across. But obviously, it's good to have these type of safeguards in place, of course, and for many different other reasons, and potentially just setting it up so when you push to the repository, it gets checked. Okay, so I do hope that's kind of whet the appetite for more GitHub Actions with Django. Obviously, this is just a simple introduction to GitHub Actions and Django and setting out some important aspects like testing and code quality. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.